we're the most violent species on this planet. So that looks bad, and one can certainly make some conclusions about human nature from that. But at the same time, we are the most cooperative and self-sacrificing and empathic and kind. So making sense of humans versus all the other species, the totally challenging thing is, how can we be so awful to some other humans and so great to other humans? How can we be so good and bad? And sometimes the same behavior can count as this in one circumstance or that in the other circumstance.
I'm very happy to be speaking with you again. We had a great conversation last year in June, I guess it was, yeah. And we discussed mainly issues that you raise in your latest book, Determined. This idea that there is no such thing as free will, and what are the implications of that, and issues like punishment and motivation in a world without free will. And this time I would like to talk about the science that you've been doing for decades, things like stress, depression, and because it affects so many of us, basically millions of people around the world. And so understanding these things and how to maybe deal with them is like hugely important, and it's especially relevant for Ukrainians as we're living through the reality of a full-scale war. I'd like to start now with depression. Like, what's interesting to me is that we use this term depression all the time in our daily lives to basically describe everyday disappointments. We might say that like, I'm feeling depressed because I didn't do well on some important presentation at work, that I had spent like weeks preparing for, or that I was looking forward to spending time, outside with friends, and I got sick like last night, and now I can't go and meet with them, so feeling kind of depressed. But for neuroscientists like you, I guess the depression means something like quite different and far more serious, right? So could you please explain how you define depression and how can it have such a devastating impact on people's lives, like oftentimes leading to suicide and things like that? Yeah.
Well, I'm very glad you made that point at the beginning, because it's a dangerous feature of language in English and Ukrainian, apparently, that you can say, yes, I'm depressed because our football team was eliminated from World Cup. Yes, I'm depressed because, and it suggests a continuum between everyday depression and the biological disease of depression. And that's not true. And the danger of that continuum is that it coaxes people to say, everybody gets depressed. Depressing stuff happens to everybody. Come on, what's wrong with you? Why are you not functioning? Everybody gets depressed, and they toughen up and they push forward. And nobody would ever say, I'm feeling a little bit diabetic today. There's no equivalent. Diabetes is a disease. And there's no equivalent in language of saying, oh, what a day. I only ate half my sandwich. I'm feeling a little bit diabetic. The danger is to get people to begin to think that depression every day and depression, a biological disease, are somehow the same thing. What is major depression? And I guess I'll call it that for this. It is as real of a biological disease as is diabetes. And it is real in the way that psychiatry often defines when you have transitioned into a real disease stage. It is real in that people cannot function when they have severe depression. Forget disrupting quality of life, happiness in life. People cannot get out of bed. People cannot go to work. So it is very devastating on people. And it's real biology. It's not someone who just does not have the right outlook on life, that they should be able to cure their depression by just focusing on optimism. It's a disease, probably the best, most insightful definition I've heard of depression. It's a disease where the pathology is you cannot rationalize away reality. we're all pretty good at that. We're all pretty good at ignoring the fact that we're not going to live forever. We're all pretty good at ignoring the world is warming up. We're all pretty good at deciding our failures were someone else's fault. We're pretty good at reframing stuff. And I think the most meaningful way of thinking about depression, amid it being a disease of grief and guilt and self-injury and changes in the body, it's a disease where you just face reality. Most people are pathologically optimistic. Most people are good at putting out of their minds how tough things are. Depression is a disease where that breaks down.
A few years ago, you gave this updated lecture on depression, right? And it was viewed by, sadly, by a huge number of people. And I say sadly because it suggests that many people struggle with depression themselves, or at least they feel like they're experiencing something like that. And that lecture was actually also translated into Ukrainian. And I was curious, like, what has changed since your first lecture on the subject? What are some of the most important insights that scientists have gained about depression that you felt were really important to include in this new lecture? Don't give a full lecture, but yeah.
Okay. 20 years ago, whenever the first taping of that lecture was, everybody was only thinking about one neurotransmitter, serotonin. We now know serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, glutamate, a whole range of those. 20 years ago, people thought it was impossible to imagine exactly how trauma and loss in early life would make you more vulnerable to depression for the rest of your life. The studies showed that's the case. How does that work? How does that work? We've now learned a lot about how that works, which is this whole field of epigenetics, how the environment, how experience can change how some of your genes are regulated for the rest of your life sometimes. So we've gotten a lot of insights how early life trauma turns into lifelong. We've also gotten a lot more insights into the genetics of depression, in that we're learning more and more there is no gene for depression. There are no genes, plural, for depression that cause depression. What the genetics of depression is about is lowering the threshold by which life's miseries make you clinically depressed. And the people who biologically, including genetically, have a very low threshold, those are the people who are unlikely to wind up having this disease destroy their life. So we know a lot by now about how a genetic vulnerability interacts with environment to bring about epigenetic changes in that vulnerable gene. So you've got that. I would say the last area that I've been most impressed with is, depression is about you lose the capacity for pleasure, this thing called anhedonia. You're exhausted. You don't have the energy to think, something called psychomotor retardation. But the third big leg of it is you can't stop the negative thinking. It just goes around and around in your head. Technical term, rumination. People have come to appreciate the rumination is the thing that is most often just devastating.
Okay, now let's spend a few minutes talking about stress, which I guess has been the main area of study, right, for you in your scientific career. And like you spent decades studying baboons, and you come away, with some really deep and important insights into primate behavior, like from this work. And we humans are obviously very interested in understanding ourselves, like why we do what we do, but we're we're obviously primates, just like baboons, so we have a lot in common with them, speaking evolutionarily. So maybe there are some insights that you gleaned from this work that you think we can apply to our own lives to better understand why we behave the way we do. And
well, it turns out baboons are the perfect animals to study. About half my life over the years has been in the laboratory, looking at how stress damages the brain. And the baboon work has always been trying to be more optimistic. Which baboons have bodies that deal better with stress than others? What goes into that? Now, for most people, you think about like stress out in the wild. Oh my God, lions are chasing you. Somebody's trying to kill you. And that doesn't tell us a lot about the stress of your boss at work is treating you badly, that your relationship is not going well. It's a very different world. Baboons are just like us. They live in these big social troops, 50, 100 animals. And what that means is lions and leopards do not bother them very often because the males are big and aggressive and dangerous. So they don't worry about predators. And they live in a wonderful ecosystem. It's the Serengeti of East Africa. They live in a wonderful ecosystem. So a baboon only has to spend about 3 or 4 hours each day feeding itself. What does that mean? They have 8 or 9 hours every day of free time. And what do they do with the free time? They generate psychological stress for each other. They compete. They do stupid, childish things to each other. If they're having a bad day, they take it out on somebody else. They're just like us. None of us are starving, for the most part, westernized disease. Baboons live well enough that they can suffer from a lot of the same stress-related diseases that we do. So that made them perfect study subjects. I studied them over 33 years. And in retrospect, I wasted the first 20 years or so of that because I thought the most important thing to understand about baboons and how their bodies work during stress and what diseases they get, the most important thing is, what is your dominance rank? Baboons have very strict hierarchies. And if you get a choice in the matter, you would rather be a high-ranking baboon than a low-ranking one. And it looked as if low-ranking baboons, their bodies were more prone towards stress-related disease. A lot of the work I did was basically looking at the engineering of it. Okay, here's a baboon with too much stress hormone release. Is it because of something in the brain, something in the pituitary, something in the adrenal glands? So work just focusing on the mechanisms. And the most interesting thing that came out of that was if you were a low-ranking baboon, you were constantly activating your stress response for the same engineering reasons that a human with major depression is activating their stress responses. So all of that seemed very simple. You want to be high-ranking and compete and be successful. And what the later years of my research showed was that's so simplistic. Much more interesting stuff is going on. And it has to do with what is it that makes psychological stress stressful? And for the same reality in the outside world, you are going to do better in bad circumstances if you feel like you have control over what is happening in your life, if you feel like you are getting predictive information. Here it comes. This is how bad it's going to be. This is how long it's going to last. If you feel as if things are actually going to get better, if you have some optimism in it, but most importantly, if you feel like you have social support. And initially that sounds, okay, your pituitary is doing this or that. That's hard science. Social support, feeling safe and loved in the world, that has something to do with it. And it probably is the biggest factor. If you have a choice between getting more control, more predictability, more outlets, or getting social support, the social support is the thing that is probably most protective against stress-related disease. And that became clear when I looked closely enough at the baboons. You are going to be much healthier if you have a lot of other baboons that you sit and groom with and you're in physical contact with them. And if you're having a bad day, you can go sit next to them. You're going to be doing better than if you were the highest ranking male in the troop. Social support is more powerful.
In the context of Ukraine, many of us Ukrainians naturally feel kind of devastated by the news. So many people have lost their loved ones because of this war. And like I told you, I lost my uncle because of it, and basically it has affected almost every Ukrainian in one way or another. Do you have any thoughts on what we can all do to cope with this feelings of stress and anxiety? Is it, for example, possible to train your mind to become resilient over time? Maybe practices like meditation or mindfulness could be helpful. I'm sure you have something interesting to say about this. Yeah.
Well, it's easy to fall into things like, meditation or prayer or any of these things, and they can do very protective things to the body in the face of stress. My bias is no amount of meditating is going to be of much use if they are raining ballistic missiles down on your loved ones. No amount of meditating is going to be much use if you have no home or if you're extremely poor. What you see is the psychological stuff is good for neurotic, everyday upsetting things. Let's meditate so you have a better outlook on life and realize, I didn't get my promotion at work. It's not the end of the world. You still have loved ones. Yeah, that's the realm where that stuff is useful. That's not Ukraine. That's not the circumstances that you folks are dealing with. There's a reality to it that is very different from, if you do not get a promotion at work. So a lot of these stress management techniques, they're for lucky people who are living quiet middle-class lives. They have a home, they have food, no one is trying to kill them. So it's limited in that realm. When looking at Ukraine, what strikes me as the two most powerful things in terms of minimizing the psychological aspects of stress, two critical things. The first one is everyone there is in this together. The social support that is implicit in that is massive. For most people, say in the United States, terrible social stress is you may lose your job at the end of this week. You may be having trouble paying the rent. This is a completely different one. The last time the United States had a war in which everybody agreed this is a moral, just war, and we're glad we're doing it, was World War II. It was the last war where whether you were rich or poor, you were sent off to the war, whether you were black or white, and the rates of psychiatric problems like depression in the United States went way down during that period. So one thing Ukraine has going for it is everybody's in this together. I would say even more fundamentally, the second thing that Ukraine has that is protective is you guys are right. You guys are on the right side. You guys are protecting your homeland. It's not that everybody thinks it's a wonderful idea to invade Zambia right now. Everybody is protecting home. You guys are on the right side and you are defending your home. So I think the fact that everybody is in it together and that this is not a war of aggression, this is a war of defense and protection, has to be psychologically very, very protective. And again, using the United States as an example, when I was growing up, the U.S. was having a war in Vietnam, and it was an immoral war, and we had no business being there. And it was just as brutal and indefensible that we were there making war as Russia making war in Ukraine. And it split the United States in two, and people would hate the soldiers when they came back because of what they were doing, but the soldiers were victims also, and psychologically, it was World War II, Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's none of those mixed feelings. This is terrible, and we are on the right side morally. I think that is very psychologically protective.
You often point out in your lectures and books, just how unusual we are as a species, right, compared with every other animal. And is there one aspect of human behavior like this, still like to this day strikes you as especially baffling, like even like after decades of doing science, what is it about like the way we think or behave that you still struggle to understand?
I know you keep asking me for the best example, but three things come to mind. The first one is we're the most violent species on this planet. So that looks bad, and one can certainly make some conclusions about human nature from that. But at the same time, we are the most cooperative and self-sacrificing and empathic and kind. So making sense of humans versus all the other species, the totally challenging thing is how can we be so awful to some other humans and so great to other humans? How can we be so good and bad? And sometimes the same behavior can count as this in one circumstance or that in the other circumstance. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is it's amazing when you look at like the biology, the plumbing of how we humans go about being aggressive or go about feeling hugely close to someone. And when you look at other primates and you look at the neurobiology of it, it's the same blueprint. It's the same circuitry. When you are feeling love for someone, my wife, you are activating the same parts of the brain as you would see in monkeys that pair bond for life when you were seeing it's the same exact thing, the same exact thing. Where's the difference? A baboon is only going to be aggressive to a baboon standing 10 feet away. Humans can be aggressive to someone on the other side of the planet. Every time a baboon is aggressive, it's using its muscles, it's physiologically activating. We can push a button and be aggressive. We could release a bomb from 30,000 feet up in the air. And likewise, you can fall in love with someone who you've met online, who lives at the other end of the world. You can fall in love with someone and you don't even know what they smell like. No other primate, that makes no sense. So we have the same basic building blocks, but we could extend it over space and time. We can feel terrible about the people who were killed when Vesuvius erupted in Pompeii 2,000 years ago. Oh my God, it must have been so frightening for them. We can, other side of the planet, 2,000 years ago, we could read a book about a fictional character and feel angry at them or fall in love with the character or feel so protective. So we take the same basic building blocks, but we can spread it out in so many different dimensions. I would say the third thing, and this is one we talked about in terms of no free will, it's no free will because we're biological machines, just like worms are, just like trees are, we're biological. What's the big difference? We're the only species that can know we are biological machines and learn something about where the buttons are. So I would say for me, those are the three biggest things. Ooh, we're animals, we're primates, we're apes. There's so much in common. These are three domains where, like, there is nothing between us and even chimps. There's just such fundamental differences, and I would say those three areas.
I remember reading this wonderful article that you wrote for Scientific American. I guess it came out in 2012, something like this. So that means I've been following your work for quite some time. For quite some time now.
Thank you.
Yeah, like I'm this old, yeah. Like it was titled, aspiration makes us human, and very interesting that we have this thing at all, aspiration, like within our human nature, that we strive to become better people tomorrow than we are today. If we want to be smarter and to live longer, and and continually like improve ourselves. Science, for example, as you like write so beautiful in that article, it's like this very powerful tool that we developed, and it has enabled us to exactly live longer and healthier lives. I was curious to hear your view, maybe. Where do you think that capacity for aspiration, came from? Like, why do we even like try and go beyond where evolution has taken us, and and to do all this amazing stuff that we have done as a species? I don't know, like something extraordinary must have happened to our brain maybe at some point.
Yes, and I think there's an explanation for it. If you're a baboon, you can have aspirations, which is to defeat this guy in a fight and become highest ranking. And there's a whole neurochemistry that's going to motivate you. And what do? If you are the right kind of human, you use the same aspiration to get into heaven someday. Ooh, if I do this and that, I'm going to get into heaven after I die. That's a very different scale. Or if I do this or that, I will make the planet better for my grandchildren. I will solve this abstract mathematical problem that people have worked 1,000 years on. We can aspire very differently than a baboon. I think an explanation has to do with this neurotransmitter dopamine. Everybody thinks what dopamine is about is reward and pleasure and drugs that release dopamine. The reality is dopamine is actually about the anticipation of reward, looking forward to it. It's about making you do the work you need to do to get that reward. It's about motivation. It's the neurotransmitter of aspiration. And you look at how it works in us and what part of the brain and what releases it, and it's just like every other primate. And you could train a monkey pressing a lever, it's going to get a reward. It has a 50% chance of getting a reward. And what happens to dopamine in the seconds afterward? Whoa, just like us. Totally different from us, because you can get that working in a monkey or an ape for 30 minutes or 3 hours, or maybe 3 weeks of trying to become high ranking in the troop. We have this crazy human ability to secrete dopamine in anticipation for decades and decades. Ooh, this is the sort of elderly person I want to be, says the 10-year-old. This is what the wiring is such that we can sustain dopamine in anticipation, in motivation, in aspiration for years and years on end. So that's not answering your question, because we now have the same question. Why did it evolve that way? And I think it has to evolve hand in hand, that we evolve to be smart enough to predict the future. And we have to be smart enough to feel pain about history or the future or the other side of the planet. The only way you could navigate that is if there was evolutionary selection for being able to maintain high dopamine anticipation, aspiration for long periods of time. And we were selected for that. If we're going to be this smart and we're going to live for this long of a time, and we are capable of recognizing, ooh, I'd love to build a gigantic pyramid so that my afterlife is going to be wonderful. Whoa, that's a whole different world of aspiration. We evolved a dopamine system that can just be active way, way longer than any other species out there. That, I think, is the critical difference.
We as humans have this very, very strong tendency to divide the world into us and them, right? And it's like maybe one of the most deeply hardwired aspects of human nature that we do this. And it's very easy to manipulate people into who counts as an us and who counts as them, like deciding who belongs to each group. And I'd love for you to maybe explain how that works in us, like versus other species, because we do it very differently, right, from other species. And maybe as a kind of follow-up question, do you think then that things like war and genocide, something that we're experiencing here in Ukraine, they are inevitable given human nature, that humanity will always live with this, as long as like we remain humans?
Oh, well, given that I am a professor for a living, what my answer has to be is yes and no, because that's how we view things. We divide the world into us and them. We humans do that. We do that in a tenth of a second. We do that without being conscious of it. We're already doing it when we're 10 months old. It is so, so deeply in there. And in that regard, it's the same wiring as in a baboon, as in a chimp, it's remarkably similar. And of course, what you bring up is we're different in that, for one thing, we can hate someone, we could want to kill them, not because they're challenging us for this dead gazelle right here that you've hunted. It's because they think there's a different God than you think. They think how the world began is differently. They have different economic views about how wealth should be distributed. Whoa, that is bizarre ideology. They think this football team is better than that football team. So for one thing, we can have really, really abstract reasons for hating someone and thinking of them as a them, or for thinking of someone as an us. Oh my God, that's totally crazy. You've got people in Japan working in corporations where every morning they get there and they sing the song for their corporation. They all line up and do that. Is an us no baboon could ever make sense of. So there's that. The other critical thing is, more than any other species, we can be part of multiple us-them categories. We can be part of multiple hierarchies. You could be very low ranking at work. You've got some terrible job. You're poorly paid down in this corporation. But at the same time, you were the captain of the company's football team this year. You were high ranking in there, and executives look at you on the football field with envy and say, oh my God, I so admire him, how good he is at that. And then you finish that and you go back to work and you're in the room where you sweep the floors at night or something. We can belong to different hierarchies, more than one at the same time. And what we're really good at is changing which hierarchy seems most important at that time. And for us, if we are low ranking in one setting, you've got the terrible job. You could say, at least I'm respected at my church. At least my family, I love them. And at least I'm captain of the football team, as to how you feel about yourself. But as you said, even more importantly, which aspect of somebody else's hierarchies, multiple, which aspect are you considering to be most important? Because they can count as a them in this category, and they can count as an us. In that one, what are the circumstances where, oh, this person is an enemy, this person, oh, they've got the same religion I do. They're actually an us. Oh, this person who you dislike, they're rooting for the same football team. They're an us. And really interesting neurobiological studies have shown somebody's face is different from yours, and you could see parts of the brain in a fraction of a second will activate having to do with fear and aggression and all of that. And now you show them the same picture and they're wearing a shirt with a logo for your favorite football team. Oh my God. And the brain responds completely differently. They are in us now in 1/10 of a second. So the really interesting, we can just change those categories instantly.
But do you think that, again, there will always be people like Hitler or Putin for as long as humans are around? There's this Steven Pinker, who we mentioned quite a bit right in our previous conversation. He might say that we're living in the best time in history, but obviously we still have a major war in Europe, like the war in Ukraine, and no one knows like how it will end, or whether it will end at all, or it could spread to other countries. Like each time I read about this is kind of depressing for me a bit, because the history of Ukraine has been like really tragic, and this idea that things like this could happen to us, like who knows for how long into the future.
Well, I think the pessimistic side is, I think we've always had Putins, we've always had Stalin, we've always had Hitler. In the past, Stalin would have been the most awful person in this village. And maybe they would have like a big club to hit somebody with. Now, Stalin, the equivalent, can kill millions of people and has weapons, guns that can shoot 20 times in a second. So technology has made our Putins and Stalins much, much more dangerous. At the same time, our mechanisms for trying to contain them have technologically gotten much better. So maybe that balances out. Maybe what will change is, yes, it's inevitable that we have us-them categories, I think, and we'll get better at getting people to have safer ones. And maybe someday the world will be peaceful enough that we're going to have us-them categories. Ooh, we take better care of our elderly people than those people take care of their elderly people. We're better than them. Ooh, we have a higher literacy rate in our children than they do. That maybe that will turn into the us-them version. Ooh, we're nicer people than they are. What a bizarre world if that's going to be us-them. And I think it is almost inevitable that you're going to like us's more than you like them, because our burial ceremonies are so much more moving than their burials. We're going to find us-thems everywhere. Hopefully we'll find ways that they are safer. I read this bizarre story recently. There were 2 high schools in the United States, secondary schools in this one town, and they were rivals. Their basketball teams had been fighting each other for 30 years. They were rival teams, and something came up where there was some wonderful charity in town, poor people who needed to have this rebuilt or something, and there was a competition between the 2 high schools as to which could raise the most money to help poor people in their town. And before it was over with, students from one of the high schools came at night with spray paint and spray painted the walls of this high school, saying the people in this high school are selfish and they don't care. And they came back and did it the other. Oh my God, they're vandalizing each other's high schools over who is kinder. Maybe that's the safest version of it. Maybe that's what will count as success. Ooh, we're kinder than they are. Hooray for us.
We spent quite a bit of time in our previous conversation discussing free will, mainly inspired by your latest book, Determined. I'd like to ask you, it's not so much a question, just a point I'd like to share with you and see whether it resonates with you at all. Like, to my mind, even if free will doesn't exist, and you make a very strong case against the existence of free will in your latest book, Determined, and I think you would agree that we're an incredibly complex and complicated species, right? And we have these brains with roughly 80 billion neurons, and that complexity allows us to respond to the world in a huge variety of ways that, let's say, a fly or a chimp, simply can't. You point this out quite often in your lectures and stuff, that it's like so much of what we do, other species would never make any sense of. To me, you almost don't need free will in the sense that we, being these biological machines, can do all that we do, can create beautiful art and write music that moves people and so on. To me, it almost does matter that we're biological machines without any free will. The very fact that we're capable of so much amazing stuff. We're still capable of war and genocide, like we mentioned. I want to focus on the positive. To me, I find it kind of inspiring and maybe uplifting even. Being these biological machines, just like every other species, can still do so much amazing stuff.
Yeah, we're amazing in that regard. And one of the most wrong things somebody can conclude from we're machines, we have no free will, is nothing can change. Things change tremendously, all of that. How can things change if there's no free will? So, here's an example. You notice that you make terrible decisions at work in the afternoons, but you make much better ones in the morning. Ooh, there's a biology. We tend to be our least cognitively sharp. There's a circadian rhythm to that. And that's that's part of how we're working as a machine. And if you turned out to be the kind of machine that could notice that difference, and you turned out to be the kind of machine who could then say, I'm only going to make the important decisions in the morning, not in the afternoon, you can now change. You shift your schedule and you're much more, you've changed. You've become more effective while you're still the same machine. You just understood that's where that button is. Or I become much more likely to get into an argument with someone if it is just before lunch instead of just after. Because when I'm hungry, I get angrier more easily. Here's a biology. You can now do 40 years of research on exactly why that's the case and how that works. And if you're someone who turned out to be the sort of machine where you notice that and you respect observation, you can now change the way you function with stuff. I knew a lawyer who always recognized that when he put somebody on the stand hostile, where he's questioning them and all of that, he would always do it for 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because that's when they would be sleepy. And he would make sure he had a lot of coffee at lunch, and he'd be able to be tripping them up. Not only did he understand his own machineness, I better have more coffee, he understood these other machines. When they're testifying, they make mistakes when it's the afternoon because they're sleepy. I'm going to fill the morning up with witnesses who are not very interesting so I can get this guy up there by middle of afternoon. This was his strategy. He was a machine who learned how to notice that. He was a machine. So change can happen, but we do not choose to change. We turn out to be the sort of machine who can be changed in particular ways. And what that winds up meaning is there's no grounds for enormous pessimism because we're machines without free will. And there's no grounds for enormous optimism either. We're good, we're bad, it depends on the context. I don't see any moral rules or conclusions coming out of the fact that we're biological machines. This is how we turned out. This is how we are.
But I still find it amazing that, when you look at it this way, that a collection of neurons, for example, wrote Mozart's symphony, or, for me, when people might ask themselves how to find kind of meaning in that kind of world, deterministic without free will, this may be like valuable perspective for them to hear. Like, for example, if we all embraced the idea that free will doesn't exist, the world will actually become a much more humane and a much better place, right? And this, I guess, runs counter to to many people's imagination. And yeah, maybe I'd love for you to talk about why you believe that that's the case. Like, how can rejecting the illusion of free will actually make things better?
Well, you do not waste your time with hate. One of my challenges is to look at Donald Trump and not to hate him, and to try to figure out, how did he turn out to be? His father was a thief. His mother was like a freezer. She was incapable of love. He has spent his whole life paying people to pretend that they love him when they probably do not. No wonder he's a monster, but don't hate him. That's a waste of time. Figure out just the best ways to stop that machine from being what he is. And in the same ways, any of these realms, don't feel overly impressed with how wonderful you are, and thus you deserve to be treated. That's how you turned out. Or if it turned out that you're poor and uneducated and life is terrible, it's not your fault. Here's all the reasons why. It was almost certain that it was going to turn out. Rejecting free will is very freeing, because it takes away moral judgments from how people turned out to be, and it instead just gives you more insight into how to help them, or to how to make them act less like Putin, or it just gives you more tools, and you don't waste your energy on hatred. There was this famous American, Booker T. Washington, who had been born a slave, an African-American man born a slave, and he got freedom eventually, and he became a great moral leader, and he had this famous quote, I will allow no man to spoil my soul by making me hate him. That's framed almost religiously. Let's just frame it in terms of convenience. Oh, you got to spend a whole lot less time staying awake at night hating. If there's no free will, stay awake at night figuring out how to better direct your drones against the Kremlin, because that's how they turned out.
But I love those examples that you talk about in your latest book, Determined, that, for example, if you and I were sitting around like 500 years ago, right, and there was like some lightning storm, we would have thought that there was some witch responsible for that, and she would have been burnt at the stake. But yeah, like thankfully we no longer think that's how it works. You'd be happy to know that this book, Determined, we now have a Ukrainian translation of it, and it's like you can get it online, or like in the physical bookstores here. And it's very difficult to get online now, because people buy too many copies of it.
Probably because the lawyers for my publisher have contacted them.
I have to say, I've been fortunate enough to speak like with so many wonderful scientists since I started doing this, and biologists in particular, people like Sean B. Carroll, who I'm sure who he is, and he, like, just for the people, he, like, by studying something as simple as fruit flies, he came to some really profound conclusions about the origins of animal diversity. Right? He showed in his lab basically that these complex animals, from fruit flies to humans, they use this like ancient genetic toolkit that's been around for over 500 million years. And yes, and he wrote a wonderful book about it, and this forms most beautiful. I also spoke with Neil Shubin. I'm so delighted that he's now president of the National Academy of Sciences.
It's a powerful position in the United States.
Yeah, basically, he and his team discovered that amazing fossil of Tiktaalik, ancient fish, right? And one of the perhaps most important fossils ever found. But I'm saying all this just to point out that of all these conversations, the one I had with you last year, it was the most memorable of all of them. I'm very happy that you found a time to do it again with me, and maybe I know, maybe you'd like to share some final thoughts before we wrap up.
Oh, just who am I to give advice? I'm sitting here on my couch in California. I do not have missiles raining down. All I can do is hope that everybody stays safe there and that Ukraine will be free again and get rid of all those damn Russians occupying everywhere, including Crimea. It's, I hope Ukraine will be successful.